What's going on, everybody? Looking at another game from the 2024 Chess Olympiad. This is from the Cuba versus Spain match. And with the white pieces from Cuba, Daniel Carlos Albornoz Cabrera. And he was 25.79. And with the black pieces, Mr. Fire on board, A.Shirov, who was rated 26.66 nowadays. So let's get right into it. Game started off French defense, e4, e6 from Shirov, d4, d5, knight d2, and now we have this Tarrasch variation, c5, knight gf3, c takes d4, e takes d5, queen takes d5, and now bishop c4. Now these type of variations just in general is black. You always have to be careful. You're allowing your opponent substantial lead in development. As you see, white has gambited a pawn, and for compensation, he has its lead in development. Only thing black has out right now is the queen, so he must be very careful. And the general idea is basically just keep the position closed while you catch up in development, and with careful play should lead to equality. And for a skilled player like Shirov, he should be able to do this. I'm sure he's analyzed his position thoroughly, but let's see what happens during the game. So another queen move is forced, of course, queen d7, and we'll go over whatever errors, mistakes that could have been corrected later. But right now, we're just going to go right through the game. Please take time to hit the like button, check the links below, and please subscribe. Castle, knight c6 for Shirov, knight b3. So now white is going to get his pawn back. a6, knight b takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and queen c7 with a hit on the bishop on c4. Queen e2, and now bishop d6. All right, so now black is threatening the pawn on h2, and Daniel plays knight f5, exploiting the pin so that the knight cannot be captured. Bishop takes h2, king h1, and now queen e5. The idea here is to, of course, offer the trade of queens. And knight takes g7 check anyway. Queen takes g7. King takes h2. All right, so interestingly enough, after 15 moves, the only piece black has developed is the black queen on g7. Who would have thought? And the material is even. So, of course, I prefer white here. I don't see what black really has in compensation for just being behind in development. In this king side, of course, ripped apart. And white has the two bishops to boot in a relatively open position. All right. And white's position is much easier to play. So if I was reaching for black, I would say that black, being overly ambitious, will try to utilize the open G file, right, as his queen is already on g7. So perhaps moves like knight e7, put the rook on, in a perfect world that is, right, put the rook on g8, forming a battery against the g2 pawn, and then playing moves like b5 and then bishop b7. If he could, he would love the castle on the queen side and tuck his king in the corner, and then black would have a fantastic position. However, white gets to make moves too, so let's see how it all turned out. Knight e7, and now rook d1, bishop d7, And rook d3, simple chess. So now black will not be able to dominate the g file because he always will have to contend with a move like rook g3. So now knight f5, and that keeps the rook off of g3, of course. Let's see what happens. And in some cases threatens knight to d4. Bishop d5, and this keeps black from placing his bishop on c6, and again just exploiting the situation here with the king being in the middle of the board. So black's main issue here right now is that his rooks are not connected. Okay, so bishop d5 was played, knight d4, counterattack my A.Shirov. Queen e4, just more pressure on the b7 pawn, and also threatening to capture this knight. And so now A.Shirov plays f5, just basically going bonkers with the tactics. And when you play this style, man, you have to be very precise. I mean, it's almost like live by the sword, die by the sword. Players like this often produce some very brilliant games, as those of you might have saw in the book Fire on Board by A.Shirov, especially in his heyday in the 90s. He produced some very, very beautiful games, for those who like fireworks and tactics. What you don't see is that players with this type of style usually experience some really bad losses also. So it's it's very double-edged way to play. So here is f5. Knight c6 is an option here. All right. But then white is able to develop more of an initiative here after, say, rook g3. Again, countering that idea of taking over the g file. Queen f8, bishop g5. This is another thing that I should point out, is the weakness of the dark squares. So now that black's dark square bishop is gone, we can see that the that black's dark squares are really, really, really vulnerable to attacks, especially by black's bishop, dark square bishop. So rook g8, this is a sample line, of course. King g1, for example. f6, bishop takes f6, b takes f6, right? Can't take with the bishop because of the pawn on e6. Bishop h6, queen f7, rook takes g8, queen takes g8, queen c4, queen g6, bishop e3, e5, and this is just a example of how play could have went after the move knight at c6. Queen a4, rook b8, b3, and queen g6. So we have this opposite color bishop situation, but we can see that black's pawns are all disjointed, isolated, and so white definitely stands better in this position here. So A.Shirov opted for f5 and looked for a tactical solution. Cuban player Albornoz played queen takes d4 and went into this endgame. Queen takes d4, rook takes d4. But let me give you a sample of some of the options that white has in this position. So instead of playing queen takes d4, a very strong move for white is queen h4. And I know it's counterintuitive because it seems like, hey, maybe he's just losing, white's just losing a piece. However, if e takes d5 here, and again, this is about the exposure of the king being in the middle of the board and the lack of connectedness between those rooks on the back rank of black. So if e takes d5, then rook g3, queen f7. Notice too that the black cannot castle queenside because of the position of the queen on h4. Now queen d4, but comes with the additional tempo of attacking the rook on h8. So rook g8. Now bishop g5, replacing the taking over the job that the queen was doing on the h4 d8 diagonal. Bishop c6, and we can also see that black's bishop is bad on c6, glorified pawn. Rook e3, king d7, and just simply rook e7 check. This is good for white. All of the attacking possibilities lie with white. So instead of a move like e takes d5 here, so this is why queen h4 is possible. E takes d5 is not going to work out good. So what about just knight takes c2? Some of you may be asking, or some of you may not have even noticed. So knight takes c2, attacking the rook in the corner. Bishop f3, very strong move. And again, all of the arrows just show you that the black king really has no place to go, and that these bishops are very strong. So bishop f3, right? h5. There's really nothing to do, and black is going to be lost in this position, right? With all of these threats of bishop h6, bishop h4 check, etc., and the rook being able to come to g3 at any time. So those are two continuations off of that line stemming from the move queen h4. But absolutely nothing wrong with this simpler approach. So one's a tactical approach. This is the positional approach. So queen takes d4. And now rook takes d4, e takes d5. And black's hope here really lies in the opposite color bishop ending as far as holding on the position, because his pawn structure is inferior, and black hopes to be able to consolidate his position, right? A la connect his rooks. So after rook takes d4, e takes d5, rook takes d5. So now it is white who is up a pawn here, but again, black is hoping to rely on the drawerish nature of the opposite color bishops. So bishop e6, rook d6, king f7, so he connects his rooks. Bishop g5. This prevents a trade of rooks on d8, which black would love to do. So rook hg8, rook e1. So of course, trading off the bishops and just going to a rook ending, this would be beneficial to white. Rook ae8, and now f4. Bishop takes a2. This gives white access to the 7th rank. King g6, bishop e7. Okay, avoiding trades here and starting to create a mating net. So A.Shirov has to be very careful. Rook c8, rook e3, ignoring the pawn on c2, because again, white is trying to create a mating net here. h6, bishop b4, rook cd8, again avoiding the trade of rooks. Bishop d5, and bishop c3. You can see the walls closing in on Shirov here. Bishop e4, g4, undermining the bishop on e4, rook d8, d8, excuse me. And just very strong move here. G takes f5, check. King takes f5, and rook 3 takes e4. And at this point, Shirov resigned, right? He just drops a piece here. So G takes f5. Nothing to write home about there. I'll give you the option here. So if after G takes f5, I'm sorry, instead of G takes f5, also possible was rook takes e8. But black is perfectly fine here, and maybe Shirov was banking or hoping for this move. So if he just takes first, rook takes e8, rook takes e8, now G takes f5 doesn't have the same effect. See, G takes f5, king takes f5, and there's no way to gain a piece. And this is what Shirov wants. And this probably will end in a draw. However, after G takes f5 check, the bishop must be protected. Right? Because, of course, bishop can't take on f5 because the rooks will get captured. So king must capture, and then just simply rook 3 takes e4, and the game is over. So good game by the Cuban chess player, defeating one of the legendary players in Shirov. But now let's go back and look at some of maybe perhaps some improvements that could have been made here in the game. All right, so we're gonna start back here. Just gonna go through the opening real quick to this position right here. So bishop c4, queen d7, and of course I'm not gonna exaggerate and be like, oh, black's position is unplayable. Of course it's playable. You just have to be very careful and accurate. Anytime you're like shunning your development, running around with the queen, snatching pawns, right? You have some openings where you snatch pawns on b2. You have to be super accurate, and sometimes you have to ask yourself, is it worth just one pawn? Just to try to draw. But I guess if you're a specialist and you analyze the death out of the position, and you say, look, I can run around, I can make 7 moves with my queen and still draw. Like some people, think like that. Right, I can violate all the rules, right, air quotes, all the rules of chess, and look, I still able to hold this position after being tortured for 50 moves. So it's not that this position for black is lost by force or anything like that. It's just you have to be very, very careful. So going back to this position, right, so after bishop c4, like I said, we can see that white gambited the pawn early for development. And so instead of queen d7 as played in the game, one move that can be played here is queen d6. And play can go castle, knight f6. And there's just more of an emphasis of for black to get his pieces out, because that's what I saw was a problem in the game. It's just the lack of coordination. The king stayed in the middle way too long, right? It's like black gambled way too long with this type of idea of just keeping the king in the middle, rooks not being coordinated. So queen d6 doesn't block the bishop on c8. You see how queen d7 takes away that critical square right there, d7. So he has to kind of keep moving the queen around. And I know eventually he did gain a tempo, I think. Well, actually he didn't, because when he went to queen c7, and I'm actually speaking of this move right here. Where was it? This move? When he finally played queen c7, he really didn't gain a tempo on the bishop at all, because white just played queen e2 and kept developing. So he didn't even gain time with that. So going back to this position, queen d7, I think an improvement will be a move, queen d6. Maybe even queen d8, right? Just going back. basically just getting out of the way of the pieces. But that might be way too ambitious. But I think it's actually better than Queen D7 because Queen D7 blocks the bishop and the knight for that matter. But at least the knight has C6 that it can go to. So Queen D6 I think is an option. The play can go from here: castles, knight F6, knight B3. Right, he's gonna get the pawn back, and you have a similar position. Right, trade off. Bishop goes to E7. This is why we're not worried about playing Queen D6 because the dark square bishop's going to E7 anyway. So it's not really in the way. Knight F3. Castles. Say Queen D6. And Rook D1, for example. And to me, this looks way better than what happened in the game. Right, just a simple line here. So maybe next time we'll see the move like Queen D6. Another option, of course, if White wants to be a little more ambitious here and not just trade queens after Queen D6, Queen E2. With the idea of just swinging the rook over right to D1. Bishop B1, of course, Black wants to connect his rooks and get his bishop active. Rook D1, and now Queen C7. All right, so he gives up a little time. But as you can see, he's castled and his rooks are connected. And this is just a sample line of how things could go. And G6. And so you can see that, yes, White may have a little pressure. White has the two bishops, but Black can just trade, one of them off. But to me, this position is much better. As you can see that Black's pieces develop a little bit more harmoniously than what happened in the game. So that's my first recommendation is Queen D6 instead of Queen D7 for Black. So Queen D6 or Queen D8, but I'll stick with Queen D6. So let's move on from there. So after Queen D7, castle, Knight C6 was played. Nothing wrong with Knight C6. Another option, of course, is Knight F6. You probably have similar play. See? There's that idea I spoke about earlier, developing the bishop on B7. Gaining this tempo right here, B5. And F3. And again, just trade the queens if White is not being too ambitious. Rook C8. D5. So after Knight C6, this is what happened in the game. Knight C6. Like I said, similar positions here. So Knight B3 was played. A6. So Knight B takes D4, Knight takes D4, Knight takes D4. And now we see this move, Queen C7. All right, Queen C7, Queen E2, Bishop D6, Knight F5, right, exploiting the king being in the middle. Bishop takes H2, King H1, and now Queen E5. Now, I believe here that Black starts to get into some trouble. Right, like even up to this point, even though it looks kind of suspect, Black can still be equal in this position. So for instance, after king h1, one idea that can be played is bishop e5, right? Just swing the bishop back. And of course, g6 is protected, and the knight is threatened. So knight has to do something. However, rook e1, threatening the bishop again. Say g6. Takes, and we're back in our endgame. And let's say bishop d5, again exploiting that situation. Again with the king in the middle. Knight f6, bishop f3, knight g4, rook e2, f6. And black should be able to hold position like this. e5. And it looks, it looks kind of ugly, but again, black should just be fine here. So bishop e5 is my recommendation there, or one of them. I have two recommendations. One is bishop e5. Okay, enough with these queen moves already. This is what happened in the game, is queen e5. Other recommendations, just simply g6. And it's kind of related to the last variation. So g3, g takes f5, king takes h2, and then h5, trying to utilize the rook on the h file. Bishop f4, queen a5, rook h1, knight f6, g8, f3. Again, the bishop wants to come to b7. And here's a not so subtle threat, right, to capture this bishop right here, since there's a pin on the G file. And bishop b7, rook a d1, and queen e7. And again, you see this idea of this lack of coordination with the rooks. But g6 is definitely playable. However, out of the two variations, I prefer bishop e5. So that's my second recommendation there. Instead of queen e5, bishop e5. So queen e5 was played. Knight takes g7, queen takes g7. And we go on. And knight f5 was played here. Next recommendation here is simply just bishop c6. Actually, two recommendations. One is bishop c6 and the other is h5. Let's look at bishop c6 first. So obviously bishop c6, most natural looking move, threatening mate in one move. Rook g3, we have to stop that. And now game gets nice and sharp. Knight g6, a4, queen f6. The other rook gets into play. Rook a3, h6, b4, knight f4, queen g4, knight takes g2, rook takes g2, castle exclamation mark, bishop f1, rook d4, and we can see the game gets very sharp. This is like a A.Shirov type position right here. Rook takes g4 is basically like whoever has the best tactics, is gonna win. Whoever has the best vision is gonna win this position. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes g2, bishop takes g2, rook hg8, and you can see that white has his bishop here. So he's up a piece, so it's a bishop here and rook versus the two rooks. And now it's the bishop here versus the rook. And I give white the nod on this position. However, I think it's better than what happened in the game after this move, knight f5. I think knight f5 was a straw that broke the camel's back. The better recommendation, I feel, is just h5. So h5, rook g3, queen d4, bishop g5, rook c8 attacking the bishop, bishop b3, h4. This is the idea. Rook to h3, queen takes b2, rook d1, bishop b5, hitting the queen, queen d2, queen e5 check, f4, queen to c7, bishop f6, and rook g8, and followed by rook takes h4. Again, very sharp, double-edged type position here. And I'll give the nod to white, but I'm just saying it's better than what happened in the game. I think after knight f5 that black is basically almost lost at this point. It's just in 18 moves. So after knight f5, so again my recommendation is h5 there. After knight f5, bishop d5, knight d4 was played, queen e4, f5. Like I said, knight c6 is probably a little bit more sound, but again, I think white is already off to the races here, because after knight f5, it's hard to defend. It becomes really difficult to defend the black position. I think black is almost lost, like right on the brink of being lost. Right, we already discussed this powerful move in queen h4, but the white player kept it simple. Again, here's a alternative variation than what happened in the game. So, for instance, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, e takes d5, rook takes d5, bishop e6. This all happened in the game. But white played, at this point in the game, white played rook d6. So here's the variation. The variation is rook c5, rook c8, rook takes, bishop takes c8, bishop e3, bishop e6, b3, king d7, and rook d1. And all white can hope for is to get in, just pure opposite color bishop ending. So similar to what happened in the game. So in the game, after bishop e6, rook d6 was played, keeping an attack on the bishop, as opposed to the variation where white went to c5 with this idea. But in the game, he just attacked the bishop, and then he went on to win. So that's a wrap for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this game. We're going to be looking at another game between I forget the other player, but we're going to look at a game from Bardura Yabova, and yeah. Please hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the thumbs up at the very least. Check the box for the donation links and books related to the opening. So we looked at a French defense. So we'll see books, DVDs down there, which are related to the opening. And I'll see you guys on the next video.